In our last video in Chapter 5, we want to look at both an example of fiscal and monetary policy in order to combat a recession, and then also look at some of the data to see if this really sort of fits what we see. Does the economy have the effect that we think it has from monetary policy, from fiscal policy? And we'll look at some graphs. It's actually a fairly complex econometric technique, at least from an undergraduate perspective, called a vector autoregression. But the idea is that you say, all right, well, what would happen if the Federal Reserve, increases the interest rate by 1% or decreases the interest rate by 1%, and then you can kind of see what happens to the other variables in the system. But first, what we're going to do is to look at the 2001 recession. So now, compared to the 2008 recession and the pandemic recession of 2020, which is a very weird recession, the 2001 recession was fairly mild, although it did take a fair amount of time to fully recover from, given that it was fairly mild. So what was going on? In the 1990s, we had experienced a really long period of growth. And so one of the things that had happened was that this long period of growth combined with the new internet had led to a bubble in the stock market, especially in the NASDAQ. That stock market had popped. That bubble had popped, and we ended up with a recession in 2001. So this shows growth in real GDP. You can see we turned negative in, I guess this is the fourth quarter of 2000, and then in the middle of 2001. But we didn't have that many, negative quarters of growth, not like we did in 2008 or in 2020. Although I guess in 2020 we only had 2 quarters as well. So what did we do? We're faced with this recession. The unemployment rate did increase by a few percentage points, and the Federal Reserve cut the federal funds rate. So the federal funds rate, which remember is the interest rate at which banks lend reserves to each other, it's kind of like the baseline interest rate, had been 6.5%, which seems really high by today's standards. And they cut it all the way to 2% by the end of 2001. So they're dropping that LM curve in order to try to stimulate investment. Now there's unfortunately an argument to be made that dropping the federal funds rate this low and keeping it low for a while actually fueled the housing bubble, which then led to the financial crisis in 2008. But we'll talk about that later. But the goal, obviously, of that drop in the interest rate was to get us out of this recession. Now, along with that, we also had tax cuts from the Bush administration, the George W. Bush administration, in order to shift the IS curve, right? A decrease in taxes should lead to an increase in disposable income. Increase in disposable income should lead to higher consumption spending. We also did have an increase in spending, although that was probably more a political decision related to the 9/11 terrorist attacks than to the recession. So we created, the Homeland Security. We also went to war in Afghanistan and then eventually in Iraq. So the revenues fell. Now it's interesting, of course, because George Bush was campaigning in 2000 saying that we needed to cut taxes because we had a budget surplus. And he's saying, well, we shouldn't have a budget surplus. That's your money. That's your tax money. We should cut taxes. And then, of course, when he took over in a recession, the argument stayed the same, that we needed to cut taxes in order to bring the economy out of recession. So maybe he just wanted to cut taxes. So, but either way, we've got a dual policy response, right? We've got a shift down in the LM curve. We've got a shift to the to the right in the IS curve through lower taxes, trying to get us back. And GDP did recover pretty quickly. It was really the labor market that took a while to recover. It took us a while to get back to a similar unemployment rate that we had sort of at the end of the 90s. So one question is, all right, well, if we have deficit reduction, right? So deficit reduction, remember, is higher taxes and or lower spending. So T minus G. Is that good or bad for investment? And remember that investment, I, is equal to savings, total savings though. So private savings plus public savings. Now, we should also keep in mind that this doesn't necessarily describe the United States very well because this isn't a closed economy and the United States is not a closed economy. But let's think about what it would mean for a closed economy. So if we fix private savings, then a lower government deficit, right? So higher T minus G would mean higher I. But private savings is not fixed, right? So private savings, remember, is Y minus T minus C. And so if we have a fiscal contraction, taxes go up, government spending goes down, that means lower output. Lower output could mean lower private savings. And so actually what we would have is lower investment spending. So you have to be really careful in these types of models to remember what is exogenous and what is endogenous. And private savings in this case is endogenous, as is investment spending. And so if you have this government contraction, then you could actually decrease output overall and decrease investment spending overall. So here we can think of, a fiscal consolidation and a monetary expansion that actually counteract each other. And this might be a fairly good, model of what was happening in the 1990s because we were reducing government spending somewhat, especially in the military, while the Federal Reserve was keeping interest rates pretty low. So the, fiscal consolidation is a shift to the left in the IS curve, but the monetary expansion is a drop in the LM curve. And theoretically, if there's enough room for the LM curve to work, the LM curve can precisely offset what is happening with the IS curve, and we can end up, here at A double prime, where interest rates are lower, but output is exactly the same. And so I think we can think about, what was happening here. Like let's just say government spending is lower and taxes stay exactly the same. Well, government spending being lower, Y is equal to C plus I plus G, that will reduce output. So that's that movement from A to A prime. But a drop in the interest rate will increase output, increase investment spending. And therefore, when we get here to Y double prime, we know investment spending is going to be higher because output is the same as it was at A. We know consumer spending should be the same if we assume that taxes stayed the same. So Y minus T would be the same. And government spending is lower. So basically, government spending has gone up and investment has gone down. Government spending has gone down and investment has gone up in order to get us back to that same level of output. So that's theoretically possible. Obviously, in a super complicated economy, that's not always going to be as easy. It's easier said than done. All right, so now let's look at a little bit of the data. One of the things that we need to think about is how long these things take to happen, right? How long do consumers take to adjust their consumer spending, following a change in their disposable income? How long do firms take to adjust their investment spending if sales change or if the interest rate changes? And so all of these things are going to take, 1, 2, 3 quarters. And one of the things that we can do basically is take all of these variables of interest, put them in a fairly sophisticated econometric model called a vector autoregression, and try to see how they're all related to each other over time, and then see what happens when we change, one piece, right, and like the interest rate. And so this is trying to do that, measuring the effect of a 1% increase in the federal funds rate. And so what we have is the percentage change in retail sales, percentage change in output, and the percentage change in employment. And the horizontal axis is time in terms of quarters. So 4 is 1 year, 8 is 2 years. And so what we can see is that our increase in the federal funds rate decreases retail sales. It gets to a low after about a year and a half of almost a percentage point. GDP decreases at a low about a year and a half by about 3/4 of a percentage point. And employment decreases by not quite half a percentage point, maybe half a percentage point after a year and a half. So this is trying to say what would happen if we kept everything else exactly the same and we only increased the federal funds rate. And so what we do find is that there is some support in these vector autoregressions for the effect of monetary policy affecting the real economy, which is what our model says would happen. We can also see the effect in the change in the unemployment rate. So it would go up by about 0.1 percentage points, and the increase in the federal funds rate and how it affects the price level, we would actually see at least an increase at first and then a decrease. And the idea is that you get that increase at first due to the higher interest rates, but then the lower economic output leads to a decrease in inflation. So we do see some support in the econometric data for this type of IS-LM model.